James was a military veteran with a resilient soul, but when he returned from the battlefield, he realized that civilian life was a completely different battle. After 2 terms of service in the army, he is no longer a young man full of enthusiasm, but a man who has experienced many hardships and losses. Life after the army was not easy, and integrating into society with all the pressures and difficulties made him feel tired. The long days of hard work, sometimes to the point of exhaustion, left James with no energy to dream or hope much for the future. He works as a mechanic, repairs vehicles, and sometimes has to take on part-time jobs such as cleaning the office at night. There are even days he has to work 3 different jobs to be able to pay bills and take care of basic living expenses. Despite life's difficulties, James never let those challenges knock him down. Despite being forgotten by society, he still retains his composure and perseverance in his soul. Every day he faces tiring work, but never complains. His hands were stiff from years of hard work, and his body was emaciated by lack of sleep and rest. However, what James has always maintained is his dignity. He never allowed himself to fall into weakness or let go, even though everything seemed to be working against him. He learned to accept life, but never let it take away his bravery. James's mood is an inner struggle between infinite fatigue and relentless resilience. He does not seek attention or recognition from others, but simply does his best to get through each day. In difficult times, he often finds peace in silence, in rare moments when he can sit down and breathe. He wanted nothing more than to live an idyllic life, to be able to go home, to lie back in an old armchair and get a good night's sleep before continuing his challenging journey again tomorrow. It was James's life. Simple but resilient, hard but always full of self-esteem. It was late at night, and Kansas City was silent, leaving only the streetlights flashing faint streaks of light on the pavement. James sat alone on the bench at the bus stop, his body tired, with no strength to move. His rough fingers gripped the strap of his backpack, which was filled with labor tools from a long day at the factory and then the evening shift to clean the office. He had no energy to think about anything other than the tiredness that was spreading throughout his body, just expecting the bus to arrive fast so he could get home, bury himself in an old armchair and fall asleep he had been craving all week. The dim light from the street lamps reflected off James's skin, creating a faint, indistinct image. Still, he managed to maintain a calm appearance, as if nothing could shake him. He kept his eyes focused toward the horizon where the buses were waiting, even though his mind had completely left the present, immersed in tired thoughts. In that moment, everything around him became strange, as if he was standing on the sidelines, just waiting for tomorrow to start again, a day like any other day. But then, laughter and teasing from a group of young men nearby interrupted the silence. James didn't turn back right away, but the sharp sounds and the explosion of his voice made him pull his eyes towards the group. 4 young men, all young, dressed in baggy hoodies, walked up to him, creating a wave that tore apart the peace of the night. At first, James just closed his eyes tiredly, deciding to ignore them, but they didn't let go. "Yo, old man!" a member of the group shouted, and his mocking laughter was not hidden. James did not respond. He didn't want to react. He didn't want to make a big deal. He is a person who is used to silence, always knowing that sometimes silence is the best way to avoid trouble. But as soon as the laughter of the group of young men continued to ring, each challenging sentence, James began to feel a slight agitation in his heart. He relaxed his shoulders, feeling his body heavier as the taunts became stronger and stronger. He couldn't help but realize that these people didn't simply want to joke. They were testing him, testing the patience of a man who was tired of the pointless battles in life. This time, one of them threw an empty soda can on the ground, just a few centimeters from James's feet. A faint sound echoed in the empty air, as if to attract attention. But James still did not move. He looked down at the can. His heart couldn't help but be frustrated but tried to keep calm. "It's nothing," he said to himself. "It's just a kid's joke." But as time passed, he felt the tension in the air increase. The feeling of fatigue from his body was now blending with a nameless insecurity. The teasing starts to become unpleasant anymore. The feeling of being challenged, looked down upon, made him feel that his dignity was violated. One of the young men came closer, his face full of pride. "Who do you think you are? Don't you bother to talk to us," he sneered, his voice challenging. James kept quiet, but he felt clearly in his heart that this could not last forever. He didn't react, he patiently kept silent, but the silence was even more like an invitation for them to go further. He felt his body tense, a reflex of his years in the military, where he had learned to control every emotion, every action. But no matter what, James is still a human being. And no one can remain silent forever in the face of this challenge. He sighed, got up from the bench, his body much taller than the group of young people. His every move is slow, controlled, not in a hurry. He looked into the eyes of the young man who was challenging him, and his voice was deep and firm. "I'm just waiting for the bus." The sentence is simple, but it carries an undeniable power. He didn't want to cause a fight, but he also didn't let anyone look down on him. The young men at first seemed to be just having fun, but James's gaze and attitude made them slow down. They didn't expect a man who looked as if he had nothing to lose could be so resolute. The whole space suddenly became tense, and the laughter fell silent. James stood there, his body ready, but there was no movement to escalate the situation. He understood that now, the decision was up to them. Although the confrontation seems to be over, the tense atmosphere still cannot dissipate immediately. The group of young people, although they had begun to retreat, the arrogance in their eyes had not disappeared. The young man in the cap refused to give up easily. He turned around, his eyes full of challenge. A brief silence passed, and then he suddenly lunged at James, shouting a profanity. This time he not only used words, but also took concrete actions. He swung his hand out, aiming a powerful punch directly at James in the face. James, although he was mentally prepared, the surprise still made him feel a little surprised. The young man's punch was fast and somewhat violent, but with his fighting skills and concentration, James dodged in time, avoiding the blow. However, the young man's actions made the situation more tense. The rest of the group also began to regain their confidence, as if the cap's escalation had sparked rivalry among them. Another member of the group, who had not participated in the initial confrontation, now stepped forward, trying to attack James from behind. James's feeling at this moment was as if the tension in the air began to flare up, forming a powerful wave. He sensed things were getting more dangerous, but didn't panic. Every move he made was calculated. Every move he made showed absolute control. Not a single move was wasted. Again, James did not attack, but only used his ingenuity to defend himself, dodging attacks from the group of youths, and using the strength of his body to repel those who were trying to attack him. Each time he lunged again, James only needed to use a gentle but firm movement to make him lose his balance. However, the situation was not as simple as James thought. It seems that the anger of the youth group is growing as they find themselves unable to win against a man as strong as James. Each member of the group began to get angry, and instead of just standing still, they rushed in a hurry and thoughtlessly. Although there were times when James just wanted things to stop, he understood that faltering would only make this group of young people more enthusiastic. He took a deep breath, kept himself calm, knowing that if things went too far, it could end in an undesirable event. Eventually, when another member of the group rushed in, James realized that if he didn't act immediately, the situation could get out of hand. He began to act more aggressively, no longer simply dodging. With a quick movement, he used his body and skillful hands to defeat the attackers, but did not seriously injure them. Each blow is performed precisely and gently, not to break their bodies, but to end the confrontation. James thought to himself, sometimes silence and restraint can be the right choice. The escalation was quickly stopped. The situation did not turn into a big battle, but James' presence and his steadfast attitude created a space of stifling silence. The young men in front of him now stood still, panting, no longer as confident or challenged as before. They realize that they have entered a game of chess that they cannot win, and gradually step back. The air was quiet for a moment, and then the group of young men began to change their attitude. The sense of complacency on their faces gradually faded, replaced by doubt and a hint of panic. The young man in the cap turned to look at his friends, as if looking for support, but James's eyes remained unwavering, without the slightest hint of worry. He was still standing, every muscle in his body stretched under his shirt, but every movement was very calm, not in a hurry. His years of service in the military taught him how to stay calm in any situation, and now he lives by those principles, even though life after the war has not been easy. After a while, the young man in the cap, who seemed unable to bear James' silence any longer, stepped closer. "Who do you think you are? What do you want to do? Standing here like a giant just to look cool?" His words were sharp, but the irony no longer moved James. He just looked into his eyes, and perhaps in that look, something made that group of young men begin to feel the change in the atmosphere. The young man with the cap took a step forward, pushing James's shoulder lightly, as if to test him. But James did not respond immediately. He just tilted his head slightly, holding his position. A tense second passed, and then James straightened up, causing the young man to step back a bit because of the difference in size and strength. "I already told you," James said, his voice deep and determined, with no emotion or anger. "I was just waiting for the bus. I don't want to cause trouble, but if you continue like this, I won't hesitate to teach you a lesson." The group was silent, but the tension continued to escalate. The young man in the cap chuckled, but now the laughter didn't seem as confident as before. One of his friends stepped up, his hands outstretched, as if to test James. Immediately, James reacted as fast as a wind, grabbed the attacker's wrist, turned around skillfully, and pushed him to the ground. The group still stood still, unable to react. James's actions are not overly violent, but clearly, they are precise and powerful. He didn't want to hit anyone. He just wanted to end quickly and teach them a lesson in respect. But the matter is not over. Another young man rushed in from behind, attacking with a punch, but James dodged in time, grabbed his arm, and in a subtle gesture, knocked him to the ground. Each shot of the group of young men was now weak and rushed, but no one could beat James' composure and seasoned fighting ability. He didn't fight to take them down, but simply defended himself, resolutely not letting the situation escalate. After a while, the group of young men stepped back, panting, and their expressions were puzzled. James was still standing, as firm as a rock, his hands hanging down, his expression unwavering. "You're lucky that I don't want to do anything too heavy," he said, his voice low and not a hint of anger. "But you guys have almost gone too far." James's words caused the atmosphere to suddenly change. A few young men in the group began to step back, looking at each other as if trying to retreat. The young man in the cap, who had started the provocation, now did not dare to say another word. He just threw a spiteful look at James and turned away. The confrontation ended like that, with no clear victory, but with a lesson taught. James doesn't need to use strength to win. He just needs to stick to his principles and let his composure make his opponent retreat. Late one night, as James was waiting for the bus after a long shift, a group of young men approached him and started fighting. Although tired, James remained silent, just wanted to wait for the car and go home. But the ridicule and provocative words of the youth group became more and more intense. They saw nothing but the tired and barren appearance of James, a man who did manual labor, with stiff hands and work clothes. They thought he was a weak, easily bullied man. Their harsh words and provocative actions serve as a test for James, testing his patience and patience. In those moments, part of James wanted to stand up, respond to the insults with the power he had used in the army. But he understood that this was not a battle he needed to be in. He had fought fierce battles where life and death were just one step apart, and now he is well aware that not all wars need to be resolved by violence. With all the calmness that has been trained through his years of service in the military, James restrains himself, not letting his emotions guide his actions. He looked directly at the group of young men, showing them the steadfastness in his eyes, as if he was sending a message that he was not one to be easily subdued. When one of them approached and pushed his shoulder, a push that wasn't too strong but enough to test James' patience, he got up slowly and controllably. James's appearance, still steady and strong, made the group of young men pause, confused. He didn't make any moves, but just said calmly, "You don't want to do that." His voice was gentle but full of power. When the tension peaked, the group of young people began to realize they were no longer in control of the situation. A scuffle is possible, but James knows he doesn't need to hurt anyone. Instead, he used his composure to end the confrontation. He did not bring them down with blows, but with powerful silence, by holding his stand without allowing himself to be subdued. Eventually, the group realized that they had gone too far and slowly retreated, leaving James standing alone, firm in the silence of the night. He didn't feel satisfied with this confrontation, but a part of him knew that he did the right thing. It is a victory not by physical strength, but by the ability to control oneself and know when it is time to choose peace. When the bus arrived and James stepped on, he felt no pride or remorse. He simply moved on, continuing his journey, carrying with him lessons that only time and experience could teach him. As the bus began to roll through the quiet streets of the city, James leaned back in his seat, his dull eyes looking out the window. The scene just now did not leave his mind. Although he didn't want to think about it, he couldn't help but wonder about those young people. Were they aware of what had happened? Will his cold gaze and silence really make them reflect on their actions? Or will they simply continue to repeat those mistakes in the future so that one day, they will pay the price for their thoughtlessness and arrogance? The feeling of tiredness and heaviness not only stopped in his body but also permeated his soul. Confrontations like this are not easy, and even if he chooses patience, that choice is not always easy. James knew that those young men, though they didn't realize it right away, would one day face the consequences of their thoughtless actions. Life is sometimes grim, and valuable lessons only come when one pays a heavy price. But he also couldn't help but think about himself, about the decisions he had made throughout his life. Sometimes, he wonders if he should teach those young people a real lesson, or continue to live in silence, keeping the lesson to himself, so as not to get caught up in the spiral of hatred and violence. The feeling of fatigue still did not let go of him when the bus turned into familiar streets near his home. He didn't feel satisfied or victorious. What he felt was only a simmering sadness, a deep disappointment with the society in which he lived. Those young men may have left, but James's thoughts about them and about what he went through will never fade. He wondered if there was a way for them to be aware of the worthlessness of overbearing and disrespectful toward others, if there was a way he could help them realize that real power does not come from humiliating others, but the ability to control themselves and respect those around them. When he got out of the car and returned to his apartment, he didn't feel joy or happiness. That night, he simply fell into a tired sleep, filled with thoughts and concerns about different lives, the different fates he had encountered, and the choices he had and would continue to face. When the last group of young men backed back, James did not feel victory or pride. Instead, he felt a deep contemplation. He stood there, his body still firm, but his mind flashed thoughts about the nature of strength and respect. James knew that the physical strength he possessed was not something he wanted to show off or use to exert influence. For him, true strength is not being able to defeat an opponent in a fight, but the ability to exercise restraint and choose the right course of action at the right time. He didn't need to use all his strength, but just enough to defend himself and stop the confrontation before things got too far. When confronted by the young men, James clearly felt the disrespect in their words and actions. But he also realized that these people weren't necessarily evil, they were just young people who were trying to assert themselves in the wrong ways. This made him think about how society sometimes fosters illusions of power, that in order to be respected, one must show power, must win every clash. However, James knew that true respect could not come from violent struggles. It has to be built from self-restraint, from knowing that we can hurt someone but choosing not to, and from understanding that sometimes the most powerful way is humility. Looking back at the young men, James wondered if they could learn a lesson from this confrontation. Do they realize that respect is not something that can be earned by challenge, but something that must be built through patience and the right actions? He doesn't expect them to change immediately, but James believes that deep down everyone can recognize what is the true path to growth. And for James, a person's true strength is not in who they can beat, but in their ability to maintain calm, self-respect, and respect even in the most stressful situations. Respect must start from within, from yourself. James knew very well that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He knows his own worth. And sometimes the most important thing is not to react to provocations, but instead act maturely, showing respect for yourself and for those around you. This is the real power, and James understands that, even if he can't change everyone, he can still maintain and express his values in the best way. When the light of the new day shone through the window, James awoke feeling tired, but his mind was filled with reflection. Last night was not a win or a defeat. It's a profound lesson in strength and respect. He realized that true power does not come from the ability to show power by attacking or overwhelming others. The real strength lies in the ability to stay calm in stressful situations, knowing when to act and when to retreat to keep your peace. Faced with these young men, James not only showed restraint, but also sent an implicit message that power does not always have to be expressed through violence. In fact, his actions are a testament to respect for himself and those around him. He didn't have to knock them out to feel strong. It is the silence, calmness, and control that he maintains that makes them think. He realized that, in this society, people often think of strength as something that is easily perceived through outbursts. But in fact, the greatest power is when people know how to control themselves and find ways to create change without resorting to violence. Whether those young men recognized the message right away, James knew he had done the right thing. It is not always possible to change immediately, but the right actions, no matter how small, will always have a lasting effect. He understands that each person has their own battles, challenges that they must overcome to grow up. And sometimes the most important thing is not to defeat others, but to control oneself and maintain dignity in the midst of life's temptations and difficulties. Deep down, James believes that a strong society is not one where violence prevails, but one where mutual respect and equanimity are valued.